I had been king of Velthamore for 11 years, and I had never once traveled as myself. It was not a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival, not the physical kind, though there had been enough of that too in the early years when 3 of the border lords had thought a young king newly crowned was an opportunity rather than a sovereign. No, by the time I slipped out of the eastern gate of Velthamore's capital on a gray autumn morning with my wolf padding beside me and a creased letter of introduction naming me Kale, senior envoy of the crown. By then, the survival I was protecting was subtler. It was the survival of knowing, once in a while, what people were actually like before they knew who I was. My wolf's name was Ran. He was 7 years old, silver-coated, and had the temperament of a senior clerk who had seen too many fools promoted above him. He did not wag. He did not play. He sat when I sat, walked when I walked, and had not approached a stranger of his own well since the day I had taken the crown, and he had apparently decided that was enough excitement for one lifetime. My council loved him. My visiting dignitaries were terrified of him. He suited me. We took the public coaching road south. The first carriage had been comfortable. The second had been tolerable. The third, the one that departed Marath Market Town on the 4th morning, bound for the border district of Havorn, was a battered thing that smelled of dried fish and optimism. And it was into this carriage, at exactly the moment Ran and I had settled in, and I had opened a week's worth of deferred territorial correspondence, that she arrived. She did not so much arrive as she fell in. The door banged open. A worn leather satchel sailed through it and landed on the seat across from me with a sound like a dropped quarry stone. The woman attached to the satchel followed at speed. She caught the door frame, swung herself in, pulled the door shut behind her with a clang that made the whole carriage shudder, and dropped into the seat breathing hard. She had dark eyes and ink-stained fingers and a bruise forming at her left temple that she had not noticed yet. She was wearing the kind of practical traveling clothes that had survived several previous journeys and showed it. She pressed herself against the window and peered out at the market square with the focused attention of someone watching to see if pursuit had followed. Apparently it had not. She let out a breath. Then she looked across the carriage, at me, at my correspondence, at Ran, who was sitting up very straight and staring at her with an expression that, on a wolf, was difficult to interpret. "I'm sorry," she said, without sounding especially sorry. "The next carriage is not for 3 hours, and the merchant in the spice quarter has decided I owe him for an entire display of ground pepper, even though it was his apprentice who knocked it over, and I cannot afford to wait 3 hours in that square." I looked at her, I looked at Ran. Ran was still staring. "There is no one else in this carriage," I said. "I noticed that. The 2 remaining seats are technically unoccupied." "Generous of you to observe." I considered pointing out that she had not asked. I considered pointing out that the letter in my lap contained a border lord's cattle count, which I needed to finish reading before we reached Havorn. I considered several things. Ran, who had not moved of his own will toward anything in 3 years, took 2 steps toward her side of the carriage and sat down on the floor beside her feet. There was a pause. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. Some negotiation was occurring that I was not party to. "He's beautiful," she said, and reached down without hesitation, without the careful, deferential pause that every courtier and dignitary and border lord practiced before approaching Ran, the theatrical wait for permission, and scratched behind his left ear. Ran closed his eyes. I had not seen Ran close his eyes in 3 years either. "Right," I said, to no one in particular, and went back to my correspondence. "Welcome to the carriage." Her name, she told me, was Senna. She was a wandering herbalist, which was apparently a real profession in the southern districts, though I had never encountered the term in any territorial report. She moved from town to town selling medicinal preparations, for headaches, for joint pain, for the particular kind of despair that settled into people's bones in wet winters. She had been in Marath for 6 days and had been planning to stay 6 more until the pepper incident. "Where are you going?" I asked. "Havorn District. There's a healer there who trained with the same teacher as I did. She sends word when she needs supply I can't find in the north. The southern marsh has different plants." She glanced at the letter in my lap. "You." "Havorn District," I said. "Official business." She nodded, asked nothing further, and produced a piece of dried something from her satchel, which she broke in 2. One half she ate, the other she offered to Ran. Ran ate it from her palm. I put the letter down. What was that? I said. Dried root of marsh elder. Mild. Good for wolves with stiff joints. Your wolf's back left leg has been favoring slightly since we stopped in Marath. Did he step on something? I stared at her. Ran looked at me with an expression that may have been embarrassment. He pulled it slightly, I said. 3 weeks ago, the court physics said it was healing well. It is, she said, businesslike. The root helps the last phase. He should be fully sound by Havorn. She went back to looking out the window at the autumn fields rolling past, already apparently finished with the subject. I looked at my wolf, who had eaten a stranger's dried herb without any of his usual regal suspicion, and was now leaning his shoulder against the side of the seat beside her feet. I opened my letter again. I did not read a single word of it for the remainder of that hour. By the second day, I had established several things. Senna had opinions about toll roads. They were extensive, specific, and largely correct, which was more irritating than it would have been had they been simply extensive. She had walked or ridden most of the Southern District roads in the past 4 years, and had a working knowledge of their conditions, their repair schedules, and the relative competence of the toll officers that would have been genuinely useful in at least 3 of my territorial briefings. She also had opinions about the architecture of the coaching inns at which we stopped, the quality of the bread at each, and the proper way to dress a wolf's leg, which she demonstrated on Ran at the Marath Havorn Way station with a strip of clean linen from her satchel and a paste of herbs that smelled like the inside of a forest after rain. Ran submitted to this with the patience of a patient who has decided the physician knows better. You don't have to do that, I told her. I know, she said, tying the last strip with a neat knot. He let me. That was her logic, apparently, on most things. If it wanted doing and she could do it, she did it. She had no great ceremony about it. She talked to Ran constantly, not in the voice people use when they are performing warmth for the benefit of the animal's owner, the cooing, the exaggerated praise, but in the ordinary voice of someone continuing a conversation. What do you think? She would say, scratching his ears at the way station while I read through the border report for Havorn District. Do you think your person there reads those letters by choice or obligation? Ran would make a sound that was not quite a whine and not quite agreement. I thought so, she would say and glance at me. I can hear you, I said on the second occasion. I know, she said, with the same mild serenity she used for everything. That was the point. I was the Alpha King of Velthamore. I had made border lords recant their positions in front of their own assembled courts. I had negotiated 4 territorial treaties, survived 2 succession challenges, and managed 11 years of a wolf-pack kingdom spanning 4 districts and the better part of the Southern River Road. I had no idea what to do with Senna of the wandering herbalists, who talked to my wolf, argued about toll roads, and had apparently decided that I was a person worth mildly irritating on a continuing basis. My wolf had begun, by the second night, to sleep on her side of the carriage. Not at her feet, at her side. His large gray head resting on the seat beside her, his back against the carriage wall, in the easy way he slept beside me on long campaigns, the way he slept with people he had decided were his. I noticed this. I filed it carefully under things I was not going to examine too closely while sharing a carriage with the woman in question. On the second evening, at a candlelit inn called the Wren and River, we sat at opposite ends of a rough wooden table with our respective meals, and she asked me, not looking up from a small notebook in which she was recording something, what I actually did. Senior Envoy, I said, the Crown's business in the border districts. What kind of business? Inspection of territorial arrangements. Ensuring the district lords are managing their obligations to the kingdom. She looked up from the notebook. She had a measuring quality to her gaze, not suspicious, just attentive, the way a good diagnostician looks at a patient before they speak. You don't like it, she said. I beg your pardon. The work, you don't dislike it, you're good at it, I'd guess, but you don't like it. There's a difference. I don't think, I said carefully, that you've known me long enough to make that assessment. 48 hours, she said. I've watched you read 3 different reports and set 2 of them down with the exact same expression. The third one, the one with the map in it, you read twice. She went back to the notebook. People who like their work look at the thing they like. There was a long silence. "What do you look at?" I said eventually. She held up the notebook, tilted it so I could see the page. A small, precise sketch of a plant, leaf venation, root structure, a few notes in cramped handwriting beside it. "This," she said, "every day, something new, something I haven't seen before." She set it down. "I had a workshop once, in a town called Velner, a real one, walls, a roof that didn't leak, 3 years of built-up supply. I left it." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Ran, who had been asleep under the table, shifted so that his head was resting on her foot. "Because I kept looking at the same walls," she said. "And there were more plants than I'd ever see through those walls." She shrugged, matter of fact, and turned the page. "No pack, no standing, nothing worth mentioning by a bloodline account, just the road and what grows alongside it. Some people would call that a loss." "What do you call it?" She considered the question with the seriousness she gave everything. "Mine," she said. "It's mine, that's enough." I had spent 11 years in a capital where every person in the room knew exactly what I was worth by bloodline account, where every conversation began with the calculation of what the Alpha King of Velthamore could offer or withhold, where the only way I had ever managed to hear a single honest thought from another person was to stop being myself. I looked across the table at a wandering herbalist with a bruise fading at her temple and ink on her fingers, who had no pack and no bloodline, and had just told me without embarrassment that it was enough. Something that had been tightly held in my chest for a long time did a slow, quiet thing, like a window opened in a room that hadn't had air in it for years. I looked at the map in the third report. I looked at the section I had read twice. "The map," I said. "The Eastern Pass. There's a medicinal marsh there that doesn't appear on most records. I noticed it because it seemed wrong for the terrain, wrong drainage." She was very still. "What kind of drainage?" she said. "Slow, nutrient-dense, I'd think from the soil notes." She turned a page in the notebook. "What plants?" I read her the surveyor's notation. She wrote for 2 minutes without stopping. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in the candlelight. "If that's accurate," she said, "there's a form of marsh elder there that hasn't been documented north of the Havorn River in a century. So it's worth going." "Yes," she said, and then paused, and a slight wariness came into her expression, the look of someone who has just shared something they protect carefully and is wondering whether they should have. "Why did you tell me?" I did not have a good answer for that. I had 3 technically acceptable ones, and none of them were the true one, which was, because I had been watching you for 2 days, and I could not think of a single reason not to. "Professional courtesy," I said instead, and went back to the report. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at Ran, who was still asleep on her foot, apparently comfortable. She said, and made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite argument. She went back to the notebook. I did not sleep particularly well that night. The third day was the worst. Not in the way that terrible days are terrible. Nothing went badly. The road was good. The autumn weather held, and Ran's limp was nearly gone. The third day was the worst in the way that days are worst when you have been carefully not thinking about something for 60 hours, and the not thinking has begun to require actual effort. I knew what the feeling was. I had been told about it by my father, by my uncle who had served as the previous king's chief counselor, by every member of my council who had tried over 11 years to guide me toward choosing a mate. The bond, when it came, was not a metaphor. It was not a romantic sentiment. It was a specific thing, a pull in the direction of a specific person, like a compass needle when the iron is near. The wolf knew it first. That was why the wolf's behavior was the oldest marker in the pack records. Ran had spent 36 hours behaving in ways I had not seen from him in 3 years. I was aware of this. I was not yet prepared to admit what it meant, because admitting what it meant examining what I intended to do about it, in a situation where I was traveling under a false name to inspect border lords who did not know their king was in a carriage 3 hours north of them, with a woman who thought I was a senior Envoy, and had no reason to think otherwise. So I did not admit it. I read my reports with the care of a man who is absolutely not thinking about the woman across from him, who is doing something precise and focused in a small notebook, and occasionally reading passages aloud to his wolf. "Listen to this," she was saying to Ran, cross-legged on her seat with the notebook propped on her knee. "I found a reference last year to a healer in the Havorn district. She wrote that the marsh elder here grows to 3 times the height seen in the north. 3 times. Ran, Do you understand what that means for the root density? Ran made a sound. Exactly, she said. He doesn't understand what that means for the root density, I said, not looking up from the cattle census. He understood the relevant part, she said, which is that it matters and I'm excited about it. That's all communication is, really. The specific content is secondary. She glanced across at me. You've been reading that page for 20 minutes. I turned the page. I'm a thorough reader. You turned it too fast, she said, with the pleasant certainty of someone who is correct and knows it. That was at least a 30-minute page. I set the cattle census down. What, I said, would you like to discuss? She thought about this. Outside the window, the southern road was beginning to widen, border district roads, better maintained, broader verges, the occasional marker stone of the kind that indicated the edge of royal surveying territory. Tell me something true, she said. I looked at her, Ran looked at me. That is not, I said, a specific question. No, she agreed. That's the point of it, something you wouldn't say in the ordinary run of whatever your ordinary run is. Official business and envoy correspondence. The carriage rolled on, the marker stones passed. I was 3 hours from the border hall of Havorn, where 6 district lords and their assembled households were awaiting the arrival of the king's senior envoy with all the careful preparation of men who did not know the king was coming and had no particular reason to be on their best behavior. I haven't been told an honest opinion by someone who didn't want something from me, I said slowly, in a long time before this journey. I looked out the window. I had forgotten what it felt like. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone preparing a response. It was the silence of someone who had received the thing they asked for and was treating it accordingly. That's a lonely kind of work, she said at last. Yes, I said. It is. She nodded and looked down at the notebook and did not press further, which was, I had come to understand, another of her qualities. She took what was offered and did not reach past it. She treated honesty the way she treated rare plants, with care and without grasping. Ran had moved, sometime in the last few minutes, to sit between us on the floor. His shoulder was against my leg. His head was resting on her knee. He was looking at the window with an expression of territorial satisfaction, as though he had achieved something he had been planning. I looked at him, he looked at me. My wolf, who had not approached a stranger of his own will in 3 years, was leaning against us both, as though we were already something other than 2 strangers in a hired carriage. I knew then with the certainty that bypassed argument and went straight to the place in the chest where the bond lives, what was happening. What had been happening since the door banged open at Merath Market and a satchel came through it ahead of its owner. I knew. And for the duration of the last 2 hours to Havorn, I did nothing about it. I read the cattle census. I watched the road. I listened to her read root density estimates to my wolf. I was aware that the border hall at Havorn was going to make everything considerably more complicated. I was, for once in 11 years of complicated kingship, not ready. The border hall of Havorn was a long stone building at the district's southern edge, half covered in climbing vines gone autumn red, the kind of structure that had been built for function and had accrued a kind of weathered dignity over the centuries that it had never been designed for. It sat at the confluence of 2 roads, the Eastern River Road and the Southern Pass Route, and served as customs post, district court, and occasional way station for the king's representatives. 6 border lords had assembled here. I knew them by report, Lord Adren of Havorn proper, who managed the customs revenue with more personal interest than royal interest. The Caldmere brothers, who held the Eastern Pass. Lady Voss of the Southern Marsh Territories, who was reliably sensible. The 2 river lords whose names I always confused, and old Aaron of the Mountain Holding, who was 91 and had outlasted 4 kings and had opinions about all of them. They were expecting Cale, senior envoy of the crown. They were not expecting to see 6 district lords assembled on the steps of the border hall when the coaching carriage rolled in, because I had specified in my correspondence that this was to be an informal inspection, which meant, in envoy terms, no formal reception. Apparently the border lords of Havorn district had their own opinions about what informal meant. The carriage stopped. I looked out the window at the assembled lords, the assembled household staff, the assembled guards in district livery, and the long banner of Havorn District that someone had hung from the hall's upper window, presumably in honor of the Crown's representative. "That's a great deal of people," Senna said, looking out the other window, "for an informal business call." "Yes," I said, "it is." "Is that typical?" "It is not." She was quiet a moment. "You don't seem surprised." "Border lords," I said, "are reliable in their unreliability." She made the sound that was not quite agreement and not quite argument. "I'll find the healer's house from here. She lives in the town proper, about a quarter-hour's walk." She began collecting her notebook and satchel with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to arrivals. "The Eastern Marsh is another half-hour beyond that, if you wanted to." "Senna." She paused. I had been composing something, internally, for the last 2 hours of the journey. Something that was honest without being the particular kind of honesty that was going to make the next 30 minutes considerably more difficult. I had 4 versions of it, and none of them were quite right. "After the inspection," I said, "I would like to see the Eastern Marsh with you, if that is still an offer." She looked at me for a moment. Her expression was its usual attentive quiet, impossible to read with certainty. "It wasn't an offer," she said, "but it can be. The ghost of something that might have been a smile. Don't let them keep you too long." She stepped out of the carriage. I watched her cross the courtyard, practical and unhurried, satchel over her shoulder, notebook tucked under her arm, unaware of the assembled lords, the banner, the formal reception that was almost certainly about to go significantly sideways. I watched until she turned onto the road toward town. Then I opened the carriage door and stepped out. What happened next was the kind of thing that, in retrospect, had a certain inevitability to it. Lord Adren of Havorn, a broad man, pleased with himself in the particular way of men who have been managing revenue streams with light oversight for a long time, stepped forward to greet the king's envoy with a warmth that was significantly in excess of what an envoy's arrival warranted. "Kale," he said, with the emphasis of a man who has rehearsed his warmth, "on behalf of Havorn District, welcome." "Lord Adren," I said, "I specified in my correspondence that this was to be an informal inspection." Quite. He was looking at Ran, who had stepped out of the carriage and taken up a position at my left side. Something passed across Adren's expression, the particular recalculation of a man who is trying to remember if the king's senior envoy was known to travel with a wolf of that size. "We merely wanted to ensure the proper respect for." He stopped. Because Ran had done something he had not done in 3 years, in 4 districts, in 11 years of accompanying me to every territorial inspection, every border negotiation, every council meeting, every ceremony. He had left my side. He had turned with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who knows exactly where they are going, and had walked toward the road that led to town. He stopped at the edge of the courtyard. He looked back at me. He sat. The entire assembled border court of Havorn District was watching my wolf sit at the edge of the courtyard and look at me. I understood. Of course I understood. I had understood for 2 hours in the carriage, and I had been hoping, with the futile hope of a man who knows he is losing an argument with something considerably larger than himself, that the bond would have the decency to wait until I had finished the inspection. The bond, apparently, agreed with Rand's assessment of my tendency toward excessive postponement. I looked at the assembled lords. I looked at old Aaron, 91 years old and watching me with the expression of someone who has seen this particular situation play out before and has opinions about how it ends. I looked at Lady Voss, who had gone very still in the way of someone who is doing rapid mental accounting. I looked at my wrist. The mate mark on a Wolfpack Alpha is not a wound and not a brand. It does not hurt, does not burn in the melodramatic fashion of old pack stories. It warms. It warms in the way that a coal warms when you add air to it, a quiet, steady increase that goes from ambient to unmistakable in the space of a few breaths. It had been warming since Marath. It was now in the courtyard of Havorn's border hall, before 6 district lords and their assembled households, quite unmistakably lit. Old Aaron said, from the far edge of the reception line, in the voice of a man who has survived 4 kings and been surprised by none of them, "That is not the senior envoy." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. Lord Adren looked at my wrist. He looked at Ran. He looked at my face with the expression of a man whose cattle revenue accounts were passing before his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said, with approximately 30% more respect than he had used for the Envoy. "Lord Adren," I said, "we will conduct the inspection as planned. Tomorrow morning accounts first." I looked at Ran, who was still sitting at the edge of the courtyard. "This evening, however," I paused. There was not, strictly speaking, a protocol for what I was about to say. There was no passage in the Crown's territorial code for the king telling 6 border lords that he was going to go and find a wandering herbalist in a market town to explain to her why the last 3 days had been slightly more complicated than they may have appeared. "This evening I have another obligation," I said. "The inspection begins at first light." I followed my wolf to the edge of the road. Ran looked up at me. "Yes," I said, "all right." We went to find Senna. She was in the market town, which was small. A main road, a square, a row of tradespeople's houses, a healer's cottage at the far end with a blue-painted door. I knew the blue door because Ran went to it and sat in front of it and waited. I knocked. Senna opened the door. She was mid-sentence to someone inside, something about root density, which I had apparently interrupted. And she looked at me and then at Ran and then, with the attentive diagnostician's eye, at my wrist. "Come in," she said, and held the door open. The healer, whose name was Marin, was a compact woman of 50 or so who took in the situation with one glance and said, "I'll put the kettle on," and disappeared into the back of the cottage with the tact of someone who understood that some conversations needed only 2 people. I sat at the small table by the window. Ran lay down by the door. The cottage was warm, dried plants hanging from the rafters, a fire, the smell of something medicinal and pleasant, and it was, I realized, the most comfortable room I had been in for some time. Senna sat across from me. She had her notebook on the table, but she wasn't looking at it. "Tell me," she said. So I told her. Not with the ceremony of it, not with the titles first, and the explanation arranged around them in careful formal order. I told her the way you tell someone something when you have spent 3 days being honest with them, and you have run out of the habit of not being. I told her I was Cashin, king of Velthamore, that I had been traveling as Kale for 4 years, periodically, because it was the only way I had ever managed to learn anything true about my own kingdom. That I had been in that carriage because I was heading to Havorn to inspect 6 border lords who had been managing their obligations with variable honesty. That she had climbed in through the door of the carriage, and my wolf had moved toward her before I had time to form a single reasonable thought about it. I told her what the mark on my wrist meant. I told her what the bond was, not the story version, the romantic account that made it sound like lightning, but the real version, which was quieter and more absolute, and had been sitting in my chest for 3 days warming like a coal. I told her that Ran had never left my side of his own will until this afternoon, that he had spent 48 hours choosing her side of the carriage, and that there was a reason for it that I had been not examining for 60 hours, and could no longer, in good conscience, continue not examining. I told her she was my fated mate. I said it plainly, because she was a person who received plainness well, and because there was no diplomatic phrasing for it that would have been more honest than that. When I was finished, the cottage was quiet except for the fire and the sound of rain beginning outside. Senna looked at the table, she looked at Ran, she looked at her notebook. "The Eastern Marsh," she said at last. I waited. "The Eastern Marsh with the century-old marsh elder," she said. "You read that surveyor's note twice and told me about it." "Yes. Was that?" "No," I said. "I told you because I wanted to. The fact that you were—" I stopped. I didn't know, not consciously, Ran knew. I knew something, but I was postponing it. "You were being an idiot," she said, with the gentle precision of someone delivering a diagnosis. "Yes," I agreed, "a professional habit." She looked at me for a long moment. Outside, the rain was settling in, the soft, persistent autumn rain of the south, the kind that lasted. "I'm a wandering herbalist," she said. "No pack, no bloodline worth mentioning. I have a satchel, a notebook, a list of plants I haven't seen yet, and an ongoing argument with a spice merchant in Merath about a pepper display." "Yes," I said. "That's what I have." "I know. And you're—" "Yes." She looked at Ran, who was lying at the door with his gray head on his paws, watching both of us. "Did you know," she said, "that wolves with arthritic hips compensate by shortening their stride? It's very subtle. I noticed it in the carriage because he favored his right side when he turned." I blinked. "Rand doesn't have arthritic hips," I said. "He has a mildly strained back left leg." "I know, I was checking if you'd say yes to whatever I said because you want me to agree to something." She tilted her head. "You didn't." "I wouldn't." "No," she said, "I don't think you would." She was quiet again. Marin's kettle made a sound in the back room, rain on the window, Rand's steady breathing. "I'm not going to stop," she said finally. "Stop." "Traveling, looking," she gestured at the notebook. "The road, the plants." "I'm not going to stop doing that because a king knocked on a healer's door and told me his wolf has opinions about my career choices." "I would not ask you to," I said. "Kings ask people to stop things. It's more or less what kings do." "Some kings," I said, "have been corrected on that point." She looked at me, that long, measuring, diagnostic look. "There's an eastern marsh," she said, "tomorrow after your inspection." Something in my chest settled, finally, into a shape I recognized. The warmth that had been warming since Marath was steady now, not a coal anymore, something more like a hearth, the permanent kind. "Tomorrow," I said. "After the inspection." She nodded once, brisk, as though we had settled the terms of a professional arrangement, and she was satisfied with the conditions. "The kettle's ready," she said. "Marin makes a very good marsh elder tea, which I realize is slightly on theme, but it genuinely helps in this weather." She got up to help with the tea. Ran at the door, made a small sound, not a whine, not a bark, the soft exhale of a wolf who has been working toward a particular conclusion for 3 days and has achieved it. I looked at him, he looked at me. "All right," I said quietly, "you were right." He put his head back down on his paws. The inspection of Havorn's border lords took 2 days. Lord Adren's revenue accounts had precisely the kind of creative arithmetic I had suspected from the report, and required a frank conversation of the type I was more comfortable having as myself than as an envoy. The Caldmere brothers' Eastern Pass maintenance was largely sound. With 2 structural exceptions they had been meaning to address for 3 seasons, and would now be addressing considerably sooner. Lady Voss was, as advertised, reliably sensible, and had in fact flagged the pass maintenance issue herself in a letter to the capital that had been held at the senior correspondence level, a problem I was going to address when I returned. Old Aaron sat in the corner of the inspection chamber and watched the proceedings with the expression of a man who has been right about everything for 91 years and sees no reason to stop. On the morning of the 2nd day, he stopped me in the corridor outside the accounts chamber. "The Eastern Marsh," he said. "Good walking this time of year." "So I understand," I said. "My wife was a wandering herbalist," he said. 47 years, never did stop, I just went along." He walked away before I could answer. He was, I thought, almost certainly the most useful person at the inspection. The Eastern Marsh was exactly as Senna had hoped. The marsh elder grew in dense, extraordinary stands, taller than she had read, almost as tall as I was, the root systems elaborate and deep, the leaves the precise rich green of something that had been growing undisturbed for a very long time. She moved through it with the focused attention of someone in the presence of something they have been looking for. I walked behind her and learned the names of everything she pointed at. Ran walked between us, his back leg entirely sound, his gray coat picking up burrs that neither of us noticed until we were back on the road. He did not seem troubled by this. "There," she said, kneeling at the base of a stand of elder that was easily 3 times the height of the northern variety. Her notebook was open in her lap, her hands already stained green. "Look at this root structure, Cashin, look at this." It was the first time she had used my name. Not the title, not Your Majesty, which the border lords had been using with varying degrees of genuine respect since the mark appeared. My name. I crouched beside her in the mud of the eastern marsh of Havorn, looked at the root structure she was pointing at, and felt, with a clarity that left no room for the postponement I had been practicing for 11 years, the particular rightness of being exactly where I was. "I see it," I said. She was drawing already, the sketch quick and precise. She would describe it to me later, back at the healer's cottage. The significance, the density, what it meant for the preparations that other healers in the north couldn't manage without this supply. She would talk for an hour, fast and certain, and I would listen, and Ran would sleep across our feet, and it would be, I understood, a version of the next many years. "You're going to want to note the drainage on the western side," I said. "The soil color changes, you can see it from here." She looked where I was indicating. She looked at me. "You read the surveyor's note 3 times, she said. "I told you I was a thorough reader." She made the sound that was not quite agreement and not quite argument. She added a drainage note to the sketch. Outside the marsh, Ran had found something of interest in the tall grass and was investigating it with the grave attention of a senior clerk examining a suspicious expense claim. "I need to come back in spring," she said, "when the root density is different." "Havorn is a border district of Velthamore," I said. "It is, technically, within my jurisdiction to ensure the roads between the capital and the eastern marsh are well maintained." "Is that the technical term for it?" "It is the one I am currently using." She looked at the sketch. She looked at the marsh elder. She looked, finally, at my wrist, at the mark that had been steady and warm since the afternoon in the courtyard. That was the oldest record in the pack's history of what the bond between an alpha king and his fated mate looked like in the world. "There's a plant," she said, "in the northern pass above Velthamore capital that I have a reference to but have never been able to reach. Restricted territory." "I know the one," I said. "Silver-leafed, grows at altitude. The Crown has surveyed it but never documented it properly." She looked at me. "I can make it not restricted territory," I said. "You can't do that for every plant on my list." "How long is your list?" She held up the notebook. It was thick. Several pages had supplementary notes tucked in. 2 of the edges had been repaired with strips of leather. "Right," I said. "In that case, it is possible that some of these territories are going to require better documentation and a traveling botanist with appropriate royal credentials, for the record." "A botanist," she said. "A senior botanical envoy of the Crown." She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her expression was doing something complicated and restrained and private, the way her expressions always were, the dignified, composed woman who felt things deeply and did not put them on display until she was sure. "That is," she said finally, "the most elaborate herbalist's travel permit I have ever been offered." "It is the only one you're going to get," I said, "and it comes with an interested party who will read the surveyor's notes and tell you about the drainage." The marsh was quiet. The autumn light was going gold low, the kind of light that made even Havorn's unremarkable borderland look like a painting. Ran had finished his investigation of the tall grass and had come back to sit between us, his gray coat lit amber, his expression one of settled satisfaction. She put her hand on his head. "All right," she said, the way she said it when she had considered something carefully and decided it was correct. The way she had said all right the first morning about the dried root, about the leg, about the territory of the carriage. The way she said everything, as though she had made up her mind, and the matter was now simply a fact about the world. She looked at me, her dark eyes were steady. "All right," she said again, and this time it meant something else entirely, something that did not need elaborating. I had 11 years of sovereignty behind me, 11 years of territorial treaties and council chambers, and the particular loneliness of being a man whom everyone in the room is performing for. I had been told in the abstract what the bond was, but no one had told me what it actually felt like when the person said yes. It felt like a window that had been closed for a long time, finally opened. It felt like coming in from the cold. The ceremony, if you could call it that, happened the following morning. The border lords had been informed, the previous evening, that they were requested to assemble at the hall at first light. They arrived looking variously resigned, Lady Voss, who was sensible, apprehensive Adren, whose accounts were still fresh in everyone's memory, curious the Caldmere brothers, and entertained old Aaron, who had dressed for a ceremony and was leaning on a stick with the contentment of a man who knew what was happening and approved of it. Senna stood beside me in the autumn light in front of the border hall's arched entrance. The climbing vines gone red behind us and ran at our feet, with her satchel over her shoulder because I had told her she did not need to leave it, and she had told me she was not leaving it, and she had, as with most things, been correct. She was wearing her traveling clothes. They had survived several previous journeys and showed it. She was exactly who she was, and she was who she was entirely. I had a crown somewhere. It was at the capital in a box, which was where I preferred it to be. The mark on my wrist was the only visible thing that mattered, and it was steady and warm and entirely itself. I spoke the bond-claiming words in the old Pack tongue, which is not elaborate. It is the oldest words there are, the ones that predate the kingdoms and the lords and all the careful formal architecture of the Pack hierarchy. It says, in its plain original form, here, this one, mine to keep, hers to keep. Senna repeated the words after me. Her pronunciation was slightly off on the second syllable of the third word, which was the Eastern dialect variant rather than the capital form, and which I was going to mention to her later, and she was going to tell me was technically accurate if you used the pre-unification version, and she was going to be right. Rand stood up when the words were finished. He turned to face the assembled lords. Old Aaron, 91 years old, 4 kings and counting, bowed. The others followed. Lady Voss, sensible as ever, said, "Welcome to Velthamore's border territories, Your Grace," to Senna with genuine warmth. Adren said something that was mostly incoherent, but began with congratulations, and ended with the accounts. The Caldmere brothers looked at each other, and then at the banner still hanging from the hall's upper window, and seemed to conclude that it was, unexpectedly, appropriate. Senna looked at all of them. She looked at Rand, she looked at me. "The Eastern Marsh," she said. "This afternoon," I said. "You said there was a second stand on the far side of the stream." "There is. I need the root samples from both stands to compare the density." She glanced at the border lords. "You can do what you need to do this morning." "The Caldmere brothers have a structural report to present," I said. 2 hours at most." "Good," she adjusted the satchel strap. "I'll go ahead with Marin and start on the near stand. Come when you're done." She walked off toward the road. Rand watched her go for a moment, then looked at me. "Go," I told him. He went. He caught up with her in a few strides, fell into step beside her, and they went down the road together in the way they had in the carriage. Easy, natural, as though they had been doing it for years. Which, in the way that the bond counts time, perhaps they had. I turned back to the Caldmere brothers, who were holding their structural report with the expressions of men who were beginning to understand that the morning's inspection was going to be conducted at a slightly faster pace than originally scheduled. "Right," I said, "the East Pass, show me." She was wrist-deep in root samples when I arrived at the Eastern Marsh, ran at my heels. The Caldmere report concluded. Adren's creative arithmetic addressed. Lady Voss complimented. Old Aaron thanked. Marin was sketching the far stand. Senna did not look up from the samples when I reached her. "Second stand has significantly higher root density," she said. "I think the drainage here channels more nutrient from the western ridge. Look at this. This is what I couldn't figure out from the reference. The root structure bifurcates below the water table. No one documented that. No one." She sat back on her heels and held up a root section with the expression of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for and is deeply satisfied about it. I crouched beside her. "What does the bifurcation mean for the preparation?" She turned to look at me, and the expression she had, the satisfaction still there, but behind it something warmer and steadier, was the expression of someone looking at a person who has asked the right question. "It means the concentration is twice what the standard preparation assumes," she said. "It means healers who have been using the northern variety have been working at half strength for a generation and didn't know it." She looked at the root. "It means someone needs to document it properly and get it to the healers' network before next winter." "A senior botanical envoy," I said, "with appropriate crown credentials, could distribute documentation to all major healers' networks in the kingdom. It is, technically, within the scope of territorial botanical survey." "Is that technically what it's called?" "I'm making the terminology up as I go." She looked at me, the ghost of a smile, not the ghost. The thing itself, warm and bright in the autumn light. "I know," she said. "I knew the second day an actual envoy would have used the proper term." She turned back to the root samples. "It takes a king to make the terminology up." Rand lay down in the grass at the edge of the stand, his gray coat warm in the afternoon sun, his bad leg entirely straight and entirely sound, and not favoring at all. I sat beside Senna in the mud of the eastern marsh of Havorn, and looked at the root structure that she was documenting with the careful love of someone who has finally found the thing they came looking for. She was going to document every marsh elder from here to the northern pass. She was going to argue about every toll road between them. She was going to talk to my wolf before she talked to me, and she was going to be right about the pre-unification pronunciation. And she was going to have a notebook that kept growing thicker with supplementary notes. And she was going to come back to this marsh in spring, and in 3 more autumns after that, and keep finding things that no one had documented. And I was going to read the surveyor's notes. I was going to tell her about the drainage. I was going to go with her when the kingdom's business allowed, and when it didn't allow, I was going to ensure the roads were well maintained and the territories were accessible and the healers' networks received everything she found. I was going to be, for the first time in 11 years, someone other than the man in the inspection chamber. I had made the mistake, I thought, of believing for a long time that the 2 things, the king and the man, had to stay separate. That the disguise was the only way to find anything true. It had been, for 11 years, the best solution I had. It turned out the solution was simpler than that. It was not a disguise. It was a woman in a worn coat who did not know what I was and talked to my wolf and argued about toll roads and asked me to say something true. You did not need a disguise. You needed the right person. Senna made a notation in the notebook. Precise, rapid, the cramped handwriting filling the margin. She would read it to me later in the healer's cottage with the fire and the rain. I already knew this. I already knew how the evening went. "There's a 3rd stand," she said without looking up. "On the far side of the ridge, I can see the height from here." "Tomorrow," I said. "Yes," she said, "tomorrow." Ran exhaled the soft, satisfied sound. He did not look at either of us. He had, as far as he was concerned, been correct all along, and the rest of us had merely caught up. The autumn light went long across the marsh. The elder stood in its tall, unrecorded stands. The stream ran past, slow and nutrient-rich, carrying what it carried. I had been king of Velthamore for 11 years. I had traveled every border road as someone else, looking for honest things. I had found the most honest thing I had ever encountered in a hired carriage at a market town, and she had been arguing about toll roads at the time, and my wolf had known it before I did. She was mine to keep, and I was hers, and for the first time in a long time I was entirely myself. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was the only thing that mattered.